Lori, and welcome to my little sewing space. I understand that you want to learn how to foundation paper piece. Well, you're in the right place. So let's go. In my home away from home, I have a very small sewing space, but I'd like to show you how I have it set up. First of all, my sewing machine, and I brought my little tiny featherweight. Doesn't need to be a fancy machine because all you're doing is doing a straight stitch. And actually, when you're working on a small project like this, a small machine works really well. And I have my cutting mat, cutting station right next to it because we're going to be doing a lot of cutting and then sewing and back and forth. So I would like to have them together so I'm not always hopping up and down. And of course I have all of my just basic sewing tools handy too. So I'd like you to understand what the template is all about. And when I write a pattern, I put the following things on here. I've got a picture of what the finished block is going to look like. I have a list of fabrics that are required and the abbreviation that you're going to find down here. I have a layout for when you have all of the sections sewn, you're going to sew them together. And then over here, it's kind of faint on this copy, but there's a 2-inch square, and its purpose is for making sure that your pattern has been printed to size. So if you're receiving a printed pattern from me, that should already happen, but if you're printing them yourself, just go ahead and put your acrylic ruler on here, line up a 2-inch square around the 2-inch square, and you want to make sure of a couple things. You want to make sure that it's 2 inches wide, 2 inches tall, and that it's all square, and that shows you that the pattern then has printed in the right format. Once you've done that, just ignore that box from then on because it's done its purpose. Okay, now looking at this, I want you to understand what's going on here. This right here is a symbol of 3 pieces of important information that tells you what this space right here is going to be filled with and the order that it's going to be the process is going to go, the order that it's going to be sewn. So the first letter refers to the section that it's in. If you look back up here, section A is these 3 pieces that are within the bold lines. And so you can see them again right here. These are all section A pieces. You know, down here we've got all B's and over here are all C's. So that shows the 3 sections. The numbers are the number of the order that they're going to be sewn together. So this is piece 1, 2, and 3 within section A. Each of the sections have numbers that start over again. So you'll see when you do each section that it's going to be in order 1, 2, 3 on up if there's more pieces than that. And after the dash comes the symbol for what fabric needs to go in there. Now, in order to get the star to come out looking like a star, we want the star pieces to be one fabric and the background to be another. So follow along and make sure that background is background, star is star. And a couple other things to note. Occasionally you'll see a circle, just a tiny little circle that I've drawn on, and that's going to be used at the end when we connect sections, and that indicates that that's a spot where we've got seam lines that need to join. So it's a joining location. Now, I mentioned it before, but there are bold lines and there are non-bold lines. The bold lines are going to separate the sections, and it's going to be on the outside right here. The light lines will be the lines that we sew in each section. Now, what you need to remember, and this needs to be your mantra, remember this all the time, all of these lines are seam lines. There are no seam allowances drawn on at all. So I have drawn where we're going to sew our, or have the edge of our final block sewn to whatever is next to it. We're going to have seam lines where we sew a section to a section. We're going to have seam lines where we sew a piece to a piece within a section. So keep remembering this. All of the lines are seam lines. There are no seam allowances shown. We're going to be adding seam allowances, and I'm going to walk you through that, but just keep in mind that there are no seam allowances drawn. One other thing that I want you to understand about the pattern is that this front of the paper is going to end up being the back of your finished block. So when we work, we're going to be flipping it over back and forth a lot, but your block is going to build up this way. So the front of your block is going to be on this side, and this will be the back. At the end, we're going to rip away all the paper. We're going to see the seam lines on this side, and like I said, the block will be this way. So if your block, if your finished design is not symmetrical, it will end up being the reverse image of whatever this is. Now this star happens to be symmetrical, so it's not a good example of that. My next order of business is to make a plan and to write it out on my pattern. So I have 2 fabrics here that I have selected for this project. One for the star, one for the background. I am told where they go on here. These pieces right here are star and all of these are background. But I want to think it through a little bit more and look at the pattern here and make some decisions. Now this one is kind of a bold, busy fabric, and this one is low volume. It does have a very faint plaid feel to it. And because of that, when I put it in here, I want the plaids to always be running in the same direction. So one of the very first things I am going to do is that on every space for star, which there are 4 of them, I'm going to write myself a little note that I want the plaid going in these directions. Okay, and that's just my information. I'm going to continue and do that on all of those spaces. Now for the board or the background fabric, do I need to worry about how it's placed? Well, a couple things to consider. Is there a design in here I'd like to fussy cut and put in a certain place? If that is the case, it's probably not the case with this particular pattern. I don't need to put certain things in the background in certain places. But if it were, what I would do, and this is where a light box comes in really nicely, I would plan it out first of all. Now you noticed I turned my fabric over. Why is that? Because remember, this is going to be the right side of our finished product. So if I had a light box, I'd put it on there and I'd move it around and I would see where I want it to be. Now I did it for years without a light box, and I didn't bring my light box with me right now. So I could also take this all to a window, hold it up to the window and see through. That would work. But if I do find that I want to, fussy cut a flower in here, I'd actually draw the flower so I know exactly where I want it to be in the end. Okay, now before, one more consideration, the grain of your fabric. Now, really the interior spaces, the grain of my fabric doesn't make a lot of difference. However, with my plaid, I've already decided I want it to be a certain way. Do I want my grain to be going a certain way along the edges? That's a question that you have to answer if you are concerned about that. And I think the biggest reason to be concerned about that is how your block is going to lay in the end. If you are concerned, go ahead and mark that you want the grain going with the edges here of your template. Now, why would I be concerned about that? Well, I have to think about what is going to happen to this block as it joins into things around it. So if there's a sashing next to it and the sashing is on grain, does this need to be? Not necessarily. If it joins right up to another block, do I want those to be on grain? Probably. So make a decision. It's going to be different with each different scenario. Some of our choices are based on how we want the fabric to lie in the final thing. If we have, like I said, a fussy cut, I'm going to worry more about the fussy cut rather than the grain of the fabric. But it's going to really depend on what you want your final design to look like. I've made all the choices that I want to make about my fabric, and I did go ahead and draw in lines here because I will show you how to keep the grain of your fabric square on your block. And I went to my light source, in other words, my window, and I copied all of those over onto the back side because, as you remember, we're going to be working on both sides of this fabric, and I want to be able to see it on both sides. So my next step, and that is I'm going to cut every bold line, and I'm going to crease the interior lines. So give me a minute here while I cut these. Okay, there I have them cut out. Now, I've saved this. Please do that because you will want to be able to come back and see some of this as you work and at the end. But now I'm going to work with one of these at a time. So first of all, in order to finish prepping them, I need to crease them along each of the non-bold lines. And there are different ways to crease, but I have found this method is my favorite. I use a surface, in this case just a piece of lightweight cardboard that is somewhat giving so that I can score them. I have a smallish ruler. It's not as thick as a rotary cutting ruler. I have a tool for scoring. You can use different kinds of tools. An empty ballpoint pen actually works quite well. I've used the back or the non-sharp edge of a seam ripper, but do be careful because you don't want to rip this fabric. See, and all it does is it makes it fold really easily. So there, I'm folding it both ways. All I'm doing is pre-creasing. So I want it to go both directions right along those lines, and I'll continue and do that on all of my pieces. I'm ready to start sewing and assembling section A, and I'm going to start with piece A1, and it needs to be background. So here's my background piece, and piece 1 on every section is a little bit unique, and that is that it just gets placed and not sewn. So I am going to take my fabric, notice that I turned it over, and I'm going to place it so that it is completely under space 1A, A1, plus it's got at least 1/4 of an inch all the way around for my seam allowance that I'm going to add later. Now, a couple things to remember. This is the right side, so that's why the right side of the fabric is out. And I have my mark here that I want this to be on the grain, so that's why I have it parallel here and it's on the grain of the fabric. That looks good to me. So I'm going to pin it into place. I'm putting the heads of my pins in a direction that's away from where my coming up sewing lines are going to be, So I put them out on this edge so they're not going to interfere in the future. Okay, and that's all there is to space 1. Space 2 is coming up over here, and so we are going to sew the seam on this line between 1 and 2. And I need to use my star fabric. Now, I'm at some point here, all of this extra fabric here of my background has to go away. And I'm going to tell you that I'm going to leave this kind of up to you on how you do that. If you want to do it now, go for it. If you want to do it later, it will work later also. So I have it in the instructions. I have one spot where you must trim, other spots where it's optional to trim. Now for me, when I have this much extra fabric, I don't like it all hanging around. So my first thing is I am going to trim some of it off. Now, this space right here is A1, which this fabric has to cover. So as long as I leave at least 1/4 of an inch beyond all the way around, it will be fine. I don't like fabric hanging down, which can give me wrinkles, puckers, make things go the wrong way, make it hard to see. So that's why I typically take it off by just doing a rough cut. Okay, so now I'm going to use my star fabric. And I have to consider several different things. First of all, when it's done, I want it to fill this space right here. I want it to be on grain, so I'm looking at the marks I made for it to be, that plaid to be going the right direction. I want it to have this side facing out. That's all when it's done. But as you know that when we sew, and if you're sewing a seam, you flip this one over so that when you open it up, it's in the right place. Now that gets a little complicated. So let me show you my way of understanding how that's going to be. So here's where I want it to be. I need to flip it around on that seam line so that it faces right sides together with space A1. And it has to fit into this space right here, which now this fabric has been flipped around. So I have to flip this over so that it matches. Now this is where it comes in handy to have things written on the back and to be able to see those crease lines. Here's my space. I can see the crease lines right here, that here's my space. I can see that my grain lines are way off. So I'm going to turn this around a little bit and realign it and put it on like this. And I am looking now to make sure that underneath this space right here, my star fabric is completely underneath there. I've got at least 1/4 of an inch all the way around for the seam, and I can pick this up and peek, make sure that it's going to actually work under here. I can see it pretty well over on this edge that I've got that 1/4 of an inch, but this would be the time to check. And I'm checking that I have the fabric going the way I want it to be. And I'm checking to make sure my fabrics are right sides together. Now, what's going to happen is I'm going to sew that seam. The fabric, the yellow fabric, is going to open up. This is going to fold over and they're going to match up again. Amazing. Okay, so I'm going to take it to the sewing machine now and sew this seam right here. Before I start to sew, I'd like to mention a few things, and that is that I have a standard 80-12 needle in here. I use Microtex, nice and sharp. I have my stitch length over here set to about 14 stitches per inch. Now that's on old machines an empirical measurement. If you have a more modern machine, it will be in millimeters, and so that is the equivalent of about 1.8 millimeter length of stitch. We use a small stitch in this process just because we're going to avoid doing back stitching, and we don't want the stitches to come out, so a small stitch handles that. I have thread. You can see my thread back here, just a standard white thread, and I have chosen a very neutral off-white, light beige. I debated, since I have the black fabric and the yellow fabric, what is most important to me, and that is I would not want a dark thread to show up on the yellow fabric, but since my black fabric is busier, if a little bit of thread color shows up on that, it won't be as crucial. So here is the setup that I had before, and I just transferred the whole thing up here to the machine. And I am going to now open up the paper, leave all the fabric aligned just the same as it was. Start down here. I'd like to start 3-ish stitches before this seam line starts in there, and I'm going to continue 3-ish stitches beyond. And so right down along that seam line. Okay, and there we go. I've got it sewn. So get it out from under here. Okay, I pulled it out from behind the machine, and as you can see now, I've got several stitches beyond the seam allowance and both ends here. No back stitch. It doesn't feel like it covers the space. That's something you're going to get used to, but it did cover it when I had it this way, so I'm sure it's going to cover it when I open that fabric up. But before I open that fabric, I want to trim off this seam allowance. Our typical seam allowances when we're quilting are 1/4 inch. Here it's not as crucial. It depends on the size of the piece I'm putting on. So I'll do about 1/4 inch. Sometimes I even do a little bit less if it's a very small piece that I'm working with. And let me just get rid of this extra stuff right here. This is a messy process, so I try to put it in the trash can, but it doesn't always end that way. Okay, and now I'm going to flip the whole thing over, but fold out this yellow piece that was covering space A2. Now what I'm doing right here is finger pressing. I do a lot of finger pressing when I'm paper piecing. I actually do it in any kind of piecing. I like to get the seam really nice and flat to start with before I press it in really well. One of the things you have to watch out for with pressing when you're doing paper piecing is that the toner used to copy or the inks can sometimes transfer over to your fabrics, and that is an unwanted thing. So if you do take it to the iron right now, please be very careful to keep it on a low temperature. I keep it kind of a medium low. And if you want to test it out beforehand, go ahead and do that, because you don't want to end up with black lines from the paper that are permanent on your fabric. Okay, so I put another pin in because I want to hold this piece in place. I'm going to turn it back around over this way. I can see now that the grain of that little plaid in that fabric lines up very nicely with the details that I drew there. So I'm happy with that. And now I'm going to get ready to do the next seam line, but as usual, there's a lot of extra fabric hanging out here, and it's going to annoy me. I know it will. So I'm going to get rid of it. And I'm not measuring this. I'm just taking it off at least 1/4 inch. So I left ample room to trim it to an exact 1/4 inch later, because on the edges of the sections we are going to do an exact 1/4 inch. Now this is going to be my next section to fill. And so this will be my next seam line. Now you've noticed that I've sewn over where my next seam line is going to be, so it's not going to open up easily. So I need to separate where this seam and the pattern are right here. And either the seam has to come out or the pattern has to rip. Well, I definitely don't want the seam to come out, so I hold on to the pieces of the seam and rip the fabric just a little bit. I'm sorry, rip the paper just a little bit so that the seam stays intact. Okay, and now this is the space that I want to be filling. So I'll come over here and I'm going to put my star fabric into this one, and I will lay it on here. I'm going to try to move it around until it fits in there nicely. And I've got my marks for the grain lines, and I want it to fit in there on the grain line. So I'm kind of looking here. Maybe it would be a better use of my fabric if I went over there. And I still have at least 1/4 of an inch on that side. I've got my grain lines where they want to be. I've got definitely 1/4 of an inch on both of those sides. And my fabrics are right sides together. So that is my set of checklists to make sure I have it positioned the way I want it to be. And I'm going to take it over to the machine now. I'm not going to show you it this time. So there I have my seam sewn. Again, I go a few stitches over, at least 3 on both ends with no back stitching. And then I'm going to flip this back over so that I can trim this seam allowance. Whoops, it didn't quite go all the way through. Okay, I've got that. Now I'll flip the whole thing over and fold this piece into place. And now I can see that my grain lines are going nice. It covers the space. I can see through it a little bit to see that it covers the space very nicely there. And I'm pressing, finger pressing that seam. And again, I'm going to put a pin in here. I was able to take that pin out because it's pretty secure with 2 seam lines holding that piece in. And there I have that piece, but now I'm going to go back to this side and I want to talk about trimming it up with my final trim. Now, as you remember, these bold lines are the edges of the sections. So on the edges of the sections, my seam allowances are going to be an exact 1/4 of an inch. So this time I want to line the 1/4 inch line of my ruler on that edge of the border line, that bold line. And I am going to cut it all the way like this. I think I didn't quite get through all of that. And I will do that all the way around now. Okay, and there is my piece A, and I'm going to set it aside and repeat the process on sections B and C. I'm going to show you what I do with B, but in a sped up manner, and then we'll join them together. Now I'm working on section B, and the first thing that I did was to make a piece of fabric out of the background fabric that was rough cut to fit into space B1. Do notice that the checklist here is that the back of the fabric, the wrong side of the fabric, touches the back of the template paper. Okay, and I pinned it in place, and then I folded down along the next seam line and placed a piece of star fabric back there. And here the checklist is that you need to have fabrics right sides together. Make sure that there is a 1/4 of an inch at least around all sides of the paper template, just the little section we're working on. And then we pinned that in place, and I sewed the seam, opening up the fold to sew the seam. Then I folded back the fold on the paper and trimmed that seam allowance down to a 1/4 of an inch. Here's what it looks like on the back when I finger pressed that star fabric open. Now I turned it over again, and this time I'm folding it down along the seam line that's between what I've already sewn and space B3, which needs to have a piece of background fabric under it. And again, the same checklist. Right sides together for the fabric, 1/4 of an inch all the way around, and then open it up, the fold, and sew the seam. And don't forget to fold the paper back and trim your seam before flipping it over and pressing the fabric into place. And then we're going to turn the whole thing over and make the final 1/4 inch trim on the finished section. Here's one final look at the right side of my finished section B. You've probably noticed by now that there's a rhythm to foundation paper piecing. Space 1, you place. Space 2, you place, you sew, you trim, you press. And each space after that, you place, you sew, you trim, you press. You continue that process over and over until you have your entire section filled. So here are my 3 pieces now, and I'm going to sew them together. I'll look at them from the back side. And here's the original layout from the paper. And I like to get this out at this point just to make sure I have everything laid in the same order that it started with. Sometimes after all of this paper piecing, you can forget what the final outcome is supposed to look like. So there I have it laid out the way it should be. And as a general rule, we're going to sew them together in alphabetical order. And that's a general rule. If there's exceptions to that, I'll make it known. But here in this one, A is going to go to B, and then this section right here, after it's sewn together, will be sewn to C. The things that we want to match when we're sewing are corner points. So I prefer to mark them while it's laying flat, because once I pick these up, especially these sharp corners like this, they get kind of shifty. So I'm going to mark, and I'm just doing it with a mechanical pencil. You can use whatever it is you like to mark with. All of these places right here where there's corners that are going to come together. Okay, let's start with A to B. So I'm going to match those 2 corners there, those 2 corners there, and there's nothing else along the way. Remember, we look for circles, but there are no circles on this seam. And so I'm going to take a pin and put it right through that mark that I just made in that corner. And I'm going to force it to match up to that mark that I made right there. Now you can see what I mean by those papers get a little shifty. In fact, sometimes after I get it pinned up here, I'm just going to fold those out of the way to keep them from annoying me. That tends to be another theme. So, and then I'm going to mark this one down here too, or join them. So right through that hole and right through that point. Now, because we cut these, we trimmed these exactly a 1/4 of an inch from the line. We can do just a 1/4 of an inch seam, and that's what I mean by folding this out of the way And I think I will take this pin out and fold this one out of the way. And go to this side and make sure everything is laying down nicely. Maybe another pin, or you can use Wonder Clips. They work very nicely for this step too, but I didn't have mine out yet. And I think I will move that one also. I'm going to take this pin out. I don't want it to, it was a little close to the edge. See if there's any other pins in here I need to worry about. There are not. Okay, now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew a 1/4 of an inch seam starting from here. And the nice thing is it's going to match right up to that little V where the two fabrics come together. I'll be right back. So here is my 1/4 of an inch seam on both sides, and this one flopped in the way again and got caught, but that's okay. I can just rip it out. So let's see what that looks like when we open it up. Now, which side do I press the seam towards? It's going to be up to you. I tend to go in the direction that produces the least amount of bulk. This right here, it wants to go that way, so I'm just going to make the whole thing go that way. And because I matched my points up nicely, I've got a nice straight connection right there and right here, that now when I sew it to this, I should probably turn it over this way, it's going to match up nicely. So these are coming off eventually. This one's getting in my way. I'm taking it off. And I want to leave some on here because, as you know, we're going to match up some dots here. So on this seam, I'm going to have 3 joins where I want to match up points right there, and right down here. And we'll get that done. Okay, there's that 1/4 inch seam, and voila. Now, I am going to, the paper has all done its job, so I'm going to be taking paper off. And you could probably see by what I've already done that it comes off fairly easily. Sometimes little pieces like this right here need to come off with a tweezer. Sometimes you can just get them with your fingernail. But I'm going to take all of the paper off. You can cut off some of these little dog ears that stick up, and then we're going to give it a good press with the iron. All my papers are gone, and now I'm going to give it a press. So I'm going to go on the back and make sure my seams are laying down flat. I have my iron set to cotton because all the papers are gone, and it is cotton fabric. And then let's look at it on this side. So there you have it, one lovely foundation paper pieced star block.